This is a woman who knows she's been found out. Our generation, those coming after us, will have to pay for the financial incontinence of people like Rachel Reeves. They may be weeping now, the entire nation will be shedding tears then.
There is no one at the top of Labour now that understands financial markets. And whereas Reeves in a new Labour government would have been the left extreme of the people in the room when the decisions are made, she's now the standard bearer for fiscal prudence.
David Cameron, Theresa May, George Osborne, Rishi Sunak, all of them bought into the Blairite settlement. What the chief executive said is worth repeating. Any restoration right-wing government is going to face profound resistance from the Blairite state.
Hello there, I'm Liam Halligan, the economist, journalist and broadcaster. I'm delighted to welcome you to this edition of David Starkey Talks. Good to see you, David. Good to be with you.
A pleasure.
So, David, surely the image of the week, if not the image of the month when it comes to politics,
or the year or the century,
indeed, is the sight of the Chancellor of the Exchequer crying in Parliament. That's going to haunt Labour for a long time, isn't it?
I think it also should haunt us as British people. And I mean, how do we explain it? She came up with this nonsense, clearly, of, it's a private matter. I think it was something much more fundamental. This is a woman, let's put it completely bluntly, who knows she's been found out. She actually knows she represents a supposed economic policy, an economic theory, which was lies, and she's at the heart of a government which, even with a majority of 165, can't govern. You began, dare I say, Liam, you almost sounded like Rachel Reeves, economist, journalist.
You say all right things, David.
Yeah, I expected to hear you had been at the Bank of England.
Well.
I was about to prostrate myself. But she, of course, famously lied at every shall we start calling things by their proper names? This woman lied at every stage of her CV. Every single thing she said was a bit, a bit like Reynolds, the business secretary. Everything is just that little bit detached from
He claimed to be a solicitor when he was actually a trainee solicitor.
I mean, an uncompleted trainee. And I'm going to give you a little test. Do you remember the MACE lecture, the MAIS lecture of last March?
No, because she said almost nothing. I remember reading it, contrasting it with Nigel Lawson's brilliant Mays lecture of the mid-'80s, which were literally mold-breaking, era-defining, revolutionising macroeconomics. Somebody just pumping out soft-left PPE nostrums.
Yes, but careful. She claimed, and she was believed by most of the commentariat, to be advancing what she thought was an economic theory that, on the one hand, reckoned with this wonderful thing called economic stabilization, and on the other, vast investment in the public sector. And you remember, she called it securonomics. And the idea was that you could spend and should spend on climate change mitigation, on EV, on the whole business of windmills, on roads, on hospitals, or the entire public sector. And do you know what? Mysteriously, this would bring about economic growth. It was, if you remember, it's called new supply side economics. It's this extraordinary fixation with a particular kind of Democrat policy, the most recent expression of it being the so-called Bidenomics of Janet Yellen. So you get, it's the equivalent of a New Deal. It's a New Deal in theory based around the mitigation of climate change. So, you get renewables and vast investment in infrastructure. It's just old-fashioned Keynesianism. It's a new form, as Keynes said, of paying people to dig a hole in the ground and then fill it up again. And any economic benefits are accidental. It sort of worked in America for a simple reason. But the Biden government could and did borrow vast amounts of money. And I don't know whether you remember, the only really sharp comment, and I'm afraid I didn't read yours, on the Mace lecture was from Jason Cowley. And what he said was, he came up with this wonderful phrase, it's Bidenomics without the bucks. And we are now in the very simple position that the Labour Party is the Labour Party is the party of the public sector. It sold itself this bizarre notion that if you pour money into the NHS, pour money into the nationalised railways, pour money into the various fantastical schemes that Ed Miliband is running around with, mysteriously growth will happen. We all know, of course, it won't, because they've got to increase taxation, and they've chosen to increase the very worst kind of taxation directly on jobs.
I agree with you, David, the sort of soft Labour left's fixation with America. Gordon Brown had it. He famously used to go to, Martha's Vineyard every summer, get his fix from the Harvard Kennedy School form of economics, plenty of copies of J.K. Galbraith's works, dog-eared in downstairs toilets across the sort of Brownite wing of New Labour. But of course, New Labour also had the Blairite wing, and the Blairite wing would always make sure there were serious people in the room, people who understood financial markets when big decisions were made, people that countered Brown's big state, Clydeside instincts, people like the late Derek Scott, former city economist, big in New Labour, Gavin Davies, Goldman Sachs partner, big into financial markets. There is no one at the top of Labour now that understands financial markets. And whereas Reeves, the big state descendant of Brown, in a New Labour government, a Blairite government, would have been, the left extreme of the people in the room when the decisions are made. She's now the standard bearer for fiscal prudence, even though her instincts are just as statist as Brown's. And another difference, David, is that when Brown came in to number 11, national debt was less than 40% of GDP.
The really important difference is that this government succeeded to a Tory government that had failed. To a Tory government that had failed because it continued Brownite policies, which have ruined our public finances. The reason, you can tell me all about those so-called realistic economists under Blair. The real truth was they simply inherited what Thatcher had done, and they gradually eroded it. The great changing point, the moment at which everything goes wrong, and here you are the economist, is 2008. It's the financial crisis. I think we, unlike any other major economy, have never recovered from that. What happened to the City of London at that point, of course, again, the complete Brownite reaction to it was, we got into the mess because we took risks. Therefore, we shouldn't take any more risks. You create the whole structure of the FCA, one of these central quangos that is such an extraordinary feature of the Blairite state, and it has slowly throttled the City of London. And the City of London was, as we all know, the great milch cow of New Labour, the famous remark of Peter Mandelson. By the way, can I tell you, as we're being terribly serious, my latest Peter Mandelson story? I met Peter, whom I know a little bit, literally a few hours before he caught the plane to DC and his elegant elegant Lutyens residence up there. And do you know what he was doing and where I saw him?
God.
It was in the Burlington Arcade, practically bent double under expensive shopping bags, illustrating he was more or less crawling on the ground with the weight, whether they were bribes, whether they were ornaments for the bathroom or whatever, I'm not sure. But anyway, the gross excess of New Labour, which was powered on the basis of Thatcherism, that has just slowly died. It's been squeezed out of the economy. So what we can now see is the Labour Party the Labour Party as it is now has got a single purpose, which is to squeeze money out of the out of the private sector to put into the hands of its client welfare class. Isn't that's all it is?
We're now in the realms, though, of what Keith Joseph called a situation where the rider is heavier than the horse, where the public sector is actually now outstripping the size of the private sector, is crowding out investment in the private sector. And no instinct in Rachel Reeves' body, unlike the Blairites, would acknowledge that there might be something called a Laffer curve. And I think we're beyond the peak of the Laffer curve.
So, in other words, increasing taxation is not actually going to increase revenue. Let me just go back to that wonderful image that you produced from Keith Joseph of the rider being bigger than the horse. Do you know what? There's a very famous French cartoon of the period just before the French Revolution, which asks the question, what does the third estate, that's the ordinary people, do? And it shows the nobles, the church, the bureaucracy, the noblesse de la robe, all piled on top of this poor peasant, crushed under the weight. We've now got a state, I think, which is just as parasitic as the ancien regime of the French monarchy. But the key thing, I think, the key point that I want to explore, I'm pushing this idea that we need the great repeal, the undoing of the legal and constitutional and institutional framework of the Blairite state. I think that is very much also Gordon Brown's creation. He was determined to create a state structure that locked the left in, that locked leftist politics in, policies and politics and politicians in permanently. And the way that he decided to do it electorally was by this permanent growth in the welfare state.
Millions on benefits that shouldn't be anywhere near benefits.
I mean, the astonishing fact that, was actually the idiots campaigning to preserve their personal independence payment. Do you remember? They actually came up with a series of statistics. Listen, everybody, that in 200 Labour constituencies, 200 where Labour MPs had won the seat, the number of people in receipt of PIP is bigger than the Labour majority. More than half households now depend on the state. In other words, they're net recipients from tax.
That's client democracy. You're creating voters dependent on state largesse.
Social democracy. This is the catastrophe, but it's also the result of a Conservative Party that connived. A Conservative Party that took an equally contemptuous attitude towards this thing called property. What I'm trying to do, and I'm sure what you're trying to do, is we've got to take that Keith Joseph. It's so good you mentioned that. Keith Joseph was the person who back the last time we were in this position was in the 1970s. We're manifestly going through a quick action replay of the 1970s. It's Keith Joseph in 1974 who recognizes that wonderful phrase in that essay, I called myself a Conservative, but I hadn't been a Conservative. I'd been a member of a Conservative government that had done nothing Conservative. That, of course, would describe David Cameron, Theresa May, George Osborne, Rishi Sunak. All of them were bought into the Blairite settlement, and they actually extended it and they entrenched it. I mean, I think you'll probably be able to correct me. I think it's Theresa May who extends disability payments to the mentally ill. In other words, that puts, unfortunately, with the very active support of the now Prince of Wales.
Yeah.
This fashion for medicalizing the problems of life. The idea that human rights include the right to be happy, to be in a state of permanent euphoria, to have no problems at all. And if you have them, there's either the state is responsible or your ill health is responsible, which the state is responsible for again, because there's an NHS. And we're in this extraordinary interlocked series of problems which are administrative, which are legal, which are political, which are financial. And I think you can see the British state, you can see the private sector, you can see active, responsible citizens. It's like the tale of Gulliver in Lilliput. You've got the giant tied down with all of these knots of regulation, of control, of legal intervention, of the insanity that judges set wages, the fact that judges control economic policy, judges control the extraction of oil, judges control the fracking. It's a completely mad world. But what I'm enjoying, we began with Rachel's tears. I responded with tears of laughter, because what we're now seeing is, I think it's the last days of this Blairite settlement. Not even the party that created it can manage it.
It won't be lost on you as a historian, but it strikes me that both main parties have forgotten what they're for. So the reason the Blairites prevailed in the late 90s, and I was heavily involved, I was a political correspondent for the FT, talking to them all the time, is because that generation, they remembered 1976. Gavin Davies, Derek Scott, the people I'm talking about, they were knocking about in the mid 70s as young advisors to Wilson and Callaghan and Dennis Healey. And so they knew the horror. They knew the public remembered that Labour messed up the economy big time and sent us cap in hand to the International Monetary Fund. Labour, today's Labour Party, they've forgotten that. Or if they remember it, they don't care. They think you can just print money. There's just insane ideology going around. I mean, I've had endless conversations with Labour front benchers over recent years as they've tried to convince me we can just print money. QE for the people, quantitative easing for the people, utter madness. And just as Labour have forgotten that they need to banish the ghosts of the 1970s, the Tories have forgotten that it's their historic role to be grown up and make difficult decisions. And I think the rot started, I hate to pin it on one person, but yeah, well, it was Cameron being determined to keep all his posh mates happy by hugging hoodies and all hugging huskies and all the rest of it. But it goes back to Theresa May saying we are the nasty party.
That's right. The Tory party needs to be the nasty party. The Tory party needs to be the party that says we can't afford it. It needs to be the party that says, wouldn't it be nice if? But what I think is so terrifying, Liam, is looking at the reaction of the Tories, for example, to the cut in the winter fuel allowance. The winter fuel allowance is the most outrageous scam. And I speak as a receiver of it. It was again, free television licenses for the elder. These were all the Gordon Brown tricks designed to suck everybody into the welfare system, and therefore everybody, on the grounds that we hate giving up anything that we have, would be committed to the full and ever-expanding role of the welfare state. Somebody has got to start to say no. And what I find terrifying is that the Conservatives, even under Badenoch, are only saying half no. They ranted in defence of the winter fuel allowance, and unfortunately, Reform is going down the deadly path of trying to outflank Labour on the left. And this seems to me to be insane. There is no point in that sort of populism. What I think the real risk is that Farage could actually, if he continues with that, and I hope he won't, and I know there's some very much wiser people around him and trying to formulate policy, but if he continues in that direction, there's a real risk he will be the English Peron, the British Peron. And we are very near to a Peronist state, and if you get the whole, as it were, it's almost blue Labour, isn't it? If you get faith, flag, and family combined with these radical redistributionist policies through heavy taxation and large-scale welfare, it is the Peron mixture, which it's taken it's taken literally the chainsaw to begin to break down, and I am terrified of that. Because I think the great risk is, we saw with the Blairite state, the terrible, terrible risk of thinking you can just reinvent the wheel. The whole determination to impose a European-style social democracy on Britain, on the ancient constitution of Britain. I think the terrible risk is that we will have Reform coming in and repeating that kind of exercise of reckless demolition, reckless pandering to innovation. And I think, frankly, that would be terminal. I mean, there is the famous Adam Smith phrase, there is a lot of ruin in a nation. But dear me, if we have had the government of the new Labour government, we have the Cameron Tory government, and then the current appalling Starmerite government to be followed by a Reform which espouses similar policies. I mean, what would you predict?
I think there is a danger that Nigel goes down that big state route. He feels there are some votes there. In general, though, I think his instincts are small state. I know the guy.
He used to be.
Pretty well. Richard Tice, who is a very influential person, not to be underestimated as a sort of intellectual thought leader. I recently interviewed Richard Tice for my YouTube channel, When the Facts Change. And let me say, David, I've interviewed most of the serious politicians of our age in this country. And he is, low bar, admittedly, but he is well up there with the most economically literate frontline politicians I've ever interviewed. He's a very bright guy when it comes to the economy. And I think Nigel trusts him on the economy. And I've no doubt that Richard Tice's instincts are very much small state as the businessman that he is. Zia Youssef as well, other people knocking around at the top
The
of
problem is they're not saying this.
They're not saying this because they're enjoying Labour melting. And also, I think, their two-child benefit cap, easing of that cap, I think they're soon going to make that contingent on other characteristics.
I mean, what the idea that they have been pursuing is it would be only available to people who were in employment. In other words, you would not get it if you were unemployed. Now, how that will be administered is another question.
It's difficult, but it's interesting the way they're using it. For me, the Tories need to be unequivocally grown up, even if it means they take a bit of a hit within their own party, because, of course, a lot of their parliamentary party are actually Lib Dems. They're not Tories at all. And my concern, David, and I say this with trepidation, and I'm not a bloke in a sandwich board, and I'm certainly not spreading woe for the sake of it. Only a major financial crisis is going to move the needle now. Only a major fiscal meltdown is going to make our thick as mint politicians and journalists understand what they are dealing with when people like me go on about the 10-year gilt yield endlessly.
It's exactly the point that I was going to say. The 1970s were conditional, or rather the revulsion from the 1970s. You use the Keynesian phrase, when facts change. What changed the facts, what changed the opinions, was the experience of the 1970s. It was the summoning of the IMF, and it was, of course, the winter of discontent. And we already have the makings of the winter of discontent in the NHS, the ludicrous demand for 35% pay increases. That's exactly going back to the insanity of the 1970s. But I was having a conversation about this yesterday with my friend Mark Littlewood, and he pointed out that our position now is infinitely worse than it was in 1976. And he was pointing out that in 1976, when the IMF intervened, they were able to, as it were, solve the problem of Britain with about 10% of their reserves. If you look at the kind of crisis which you're facing now, it would take something over 50% of the reserves that the IMF is able to muster. Now, that's politically impossible. We may actually find ourselves, and I think it's very likely we will, with a financial crisis which is very, very much worse than 1976, in which the IMF may not actually be able to solve it, or certainly not solve it by a quick and easy intervention. And in those circumstances, we're Greece, aren't we?
Well, in those circumstances, we're talking about a new Bretton Woods, David. We're talking about a whole recasting of the geopolitical economic structures that have been in place for, with respect, all your lifetime and mine. If America is faced with a Europe that's completely imploded financially, and that is not beyond the realms of possibility, and the Americans, so stretched, their balance sheet is so stretched, then you're going to have a situation where we're going to the BRICS. The BRIC economies have more reserves than the Western world. They have over half of global GDP. They have,
thousands of tons of gold.
They have most of the tangible assets that we need. That is we are going to, Rachel Reeves and her economically illiterate ilk are basically going to drive not just the UK economy off a cliff. They are going to recast at pace, to use a Whitehall word, the whole post-war global economic
system. It's collapsing anyway.
In a way, they will accelerate and accentuate the great shift of power, which is the biggest story of our lifetimes, from west to east. Mm-hmm. They will be the standard bearers for Western defeatism and mediocrity. And they will do it because, just like the Roman Empire collapsed because of debt, they will do it because of debt.
The parallels with Rome are even closer. The key episode in the decline of Rome is something that is so reminiscent of now. It is the decision of the Emperor Caracalla in 260 to double the wages of the Roman army. It's exactly what happens now. It's exactly what's happening in the public sector. It's exactly what's happening in the NHS. But what again I would like to bring home to people is back a decade ago with the financial collapses in Ireland and in Greece, what actually was visited upon people. Every person in the public sector had a large-scale cut in salary. I gather it was up to 20% or even higher in cases. Everybody in receipt of welfare had a major cut. Bank accounts, if I remember correctly, they literally took money out of your bank account. Can everybody just think about that? Forced salary cuts, forced welfare cuts, effective confiscation of financial assets. If we do not do something about this on our own, others will do it for us. And it will be of a degree of pain, of humiliation, and of national defeat, which will be of the same scale as defeat in a major war. Britain uniquely has avoided defeat in major war for centuries. We have never experienced that shattering effect of defeat. We've never experienced reparations. This will be the equivalent of real reparations. Our generation, those coming after us, will have to pay for the financial incontinence of people like Rachel Reeves. They may be weeping now, the entire nation will be shedding tears then. We've got to understand this, and we need a political party and we need political leaders that have got the confidence to say this and the confidence to do. Liam, I loved it when you said right at the beginning, the right is the party of realism. It's the party of facts. As Thatcher said herself, the facts of life are conservative. The problem is that with Cameron wanting to flirt with the Liberals, with Theresa May wanting to do her weeping, another one who cried, you remember, that shameful performance she put when she resigned as Prime Minister. Not the magnificent triumph of Thatcher in her final PMQs, but that kind of wimpy recognition of self-defeat and failure. But it has been throughout the fact that the Conservative Party has pandered to liberalism, going right back to the 19th century. The second great founder of the Conservative Party, first Robert Peel, the second Benjamin Disraeli. Disraeli understands that the enemy is liberalism. The enemy is this softness of mind.
What should Kemi Badenoch do? You're a serious guy. You've got a big profile. If you say something, she's certainly going to listen to you. She may not do what you say, but what's your pitch to her for the next 6 months?
Well, if I were being honest, I'd say the first thing she should do was resign. But assuming that she doesn't take that advice, which I think is unlikely, she has got to go to the she's got to first of all explain why the Conservative Party got it so shatteringly wrong for 14 years. You can't just say, oh, sorry, oh, we kind of got it wrong. You've got to say why we got it wrong. And we got it wrong because we followed in the footsteps of Blair and Brown. It went wrong from the very beginning. The moment Cameron said, I am the heir to Blair, the moment you get Michael Gove, with whom I'm due to have lunch shortly, that's going to be a very interesting experience. The moment Michael Gove says, and you know that extraordinary story, which, well, I'll find out whether it's true or not, that he passed round at the cabinet table copies of Blair's memoirs with stickets in it, how to do it, Blair as the new Machiavelli. You know, that was the insanity. That was the insanity. And you look at every stage that not simply didn't the Conservatives reverse, they actually make it worse. I mean, the peak horrors are in, I think, 2014 and 2015. I mean, in 2014, in the last days of the coalition government, you get the extraordinary business of the creation of the College of Policing and non-crime hate incidents. A party that was the party of the Constitution, a party that's the party of common law, to invent a thing which is purely Orwellian. I mean, again, the bizarreness of language, a non-crime incident that's treated as something that goes on to the madness of that. And then 2015 with Theresa May, the catastrophe of legislating net zero. And they spend less time on that than on even they managed to spend on the debating of the effective repeal, as far as women are concerned, of abortion legislation. It was a few minutes. This fact that has given the entire control over our fuel extraction policy and pretty well everything else to wholly unqualified judges. And the big thing you've got to say is we followed in the footsteps of Labour. But what you've then got to do, Liam, is you've got to translate that from those nice big phrases into concrete proposals. You've got to say, we are going to undo. You were mentioning Thatcher. The glory of Thatcher, right from the beginning, with Geoffrey Howe, with Thatcher herself, you undid what Labour had done. You changed that first budget. Radically changes economic and tax policy.
The Tibet employment legislation as well.
You repeal the trade union legislation. You begin the enormous fire sale of council houses. You sell off the nationalised utilities. I mean, does everybody realise we even had a nationalised travel agency? Total madness. But the Conservatives have got to say, we will undo. We will undo this. We will also make and I think, again, was got to have that sense of what Thatcher did. The manifesto of 1979 is an astonishing piece of work. It's really well written, which is very unusual for a political document. But it doesn't tie itself to specific policy. But what it does, it commits itself to a direction, to a confident direction.
And that's what she's got to do. She hasn't done that yet. She's too worried about upsetting the Lib Dems in her parliamentary party. I think she needs to have a row with the Lib Dems in her parliamentary party.
It will be wonderful. But can I just tell you, the key thing to understand about Thatcher did not, despite all the problems with the Wets, Thatcher didn't need to do that because she had the immense luck of Ted Heath throwing his gigantic sulk. That huge, decades-long sulk made clear that there'd been a radical break in the history of the Conservative Party. I mean, what I would do, I would withdraw, and I'm being really serious, I would withdraw the whip from Cameron, Osborne, and Theresa May. That would be the signal.
The sort of symbolism of that. Yeah.
Which is exactly, of course, what Boris did on a smaller scale. And it actually worked at that moment. The only way you will get rid of this terrible taint of opposition is if you have that absolute clarity in cutting it off.
David, fabulous discussion. Really enjoyed talking to you. Just to round off, let's talk about something else that caught both our respective eyes this week. In Warwickshire, you have a reform-led council, of course, one of the 11 odd councils that Reform took over, incredibly, after the local elections. And you've apparently got Bolshe local civil servants refusing to take down the pride flag.
Oh, give them their proper title. Chief Executive on God knows how many 100,000 a year, yes.
Should we be worried about this, or should Reform really make an example of these people?
I think both. We should be very worried about it, and an example should be made. But equally, what the chief executive said is worth repeating. If there is a specific ruling of the council, in other words, if there's a formal motion in the council, she would accept it. What she would not do was to accept simply the equivalent of an executive order from a newly appointed leader of the council. But what I think that underscores, Liam, is that we are going to face, if we can use the we, any reformist, or I want to use the word restoration. Any restoration right-wing government or coalition government is going to face profound resistance from the Blairite state, because the Blairites control the whole structure of our government. The quangos, the civil service, the officers of the armed forces, of the police, the lot. And there is going to need to be the same kind of extraordinary preparation for government. The idea, again, it was tested to destruction. The terrible problem of Liz Truss was she went into Downing Street thinking that civil servants who disapproved of everything she wanted to do, or the Bank of England that did, would simply obey her instructions rather than do everything they could to undercut her. So there's got to be the sort of serious preparation for government that made the enormous difference between Donald Trump's second term and his first term. In and between those two, Donald Trump didn't simply sulk. There was an enormous effort of genuine preparation. Trump had no idea what he was doing in the first term. He was completely all over the place. Series of catastrophic cabinet appointments. If you remember that extraordinary moment this time round, after he's inaugurated, he's sworn on the Bible. God knows what Donald Trump's oath is worth. I mean, he's probably auctioned it, so he'll have found out. He takes the oath in front of Chief Justice Roberts in the rotunda, and he then goes a few hundred yards to the White House. He sits down at the desk, which interestingly enough has given the name to the reform-adjacent think tank, Resolute 1850. He sits down at that desk, which is the gift of Queen Victoria to the American presidency. And what is there? There's Stephen Miller, who's been working his socks off, this brutal, efficient lawyer, working his socks off. And there's a pile of executive orders, literally, that is more than 2 feet high. And he signs them. And there's this great, again, Trump understands the monarchical principle. The British Prime Minister is supposed to be able to do this. The British Prime Minister, in theory, has vastly greater powers than an American president. He can wield the whole powers of the monarchy if he can command Parliament, as we've seen a Prime Minister like our current one who is contemptuous of politics. Can you imagine a Prime Minister who says he doesn't believe in politics? The insanity of the thing.
He chooses Davos over Westminster.
That's right. Well, Westminster has taken its revenge and Davos will not protect him. But what Trump was able to do, what we've got to be able to do, we have to be prepared. There has to be that careful drafting of the legislation that will undo the catastrophe of the Blairite settlement. There's got to be an understanding of how you head off the immediate resistance from the overweening Supreme Court. Because again, one of the terrible features of the Blairite settlement, lawyers now think they're on top of Parliament. The extraordinary decision of the Supreme Court to rule prorogation illegal. So what I think we can see in that strange little incident, in the heart of England, in Warwickshire, is a premonition of what's going to happen. But it's also a very clear indication of what we've got to do to head it off. We've to adopt that old, is one allowed to talk about Boy Scouts anymore, or am I immediately going to be called a nonce? But that old motto of the Boy Scouts, be prepared. We've got to be prepared. We've got to be ready. And again, you can see this with this government. This government had no preparation for power. It had no understanding. We've got to work. Government isn't just swanning around. Government is just, again, we've had political parties going under the influence of Oxford PPE, terrible people like Daniel Finkelstein. Oh, you just win an election. You tweak the electorate. You lie a little bit to them. You have a Ming-Va strategy. But then you find yourself in a position, which we are now, a government of a majority of 165 can't govern. Because they're not prepared. They've not thought through. They've not confronted reality. What we've got to do, our great task on the right from this point, is to do that hard work, that preparation, but also what you and I are engaged in, which is a task of conversion. I call it evangelizing. We've got to preach a new gospel of reality.
David Starkey, it's been great to join you on this episode of David Starkey Talks.
Thank you, Liam.